But when an entire economy is based on this, it has devastating consequences for everyone. Now we come to the point. The Quran alludes to the main problem of interest. What is the problem of interest? It's important to note that the concept of interest was something that was considered detestable by every single tradition community. Aristotle wrote about it when he said, "The most hated sort of money-making, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural use of it." The Old Testament involves God speaking to the Jews in a manner that conveys an outright prohibition. The Christian view was that money charges from the temple were seen to be kicked out because of the notion that usury as profit was evil. And this was ratified by numerous councils, culminating in the Council of Vienna, which declared that any person who declared usury to be permissible was a sin and was to be denounced as a heretic. However, within the 15th century, Christian reformism, as advocated through Luther and Calvin, argued for the aspect of motive to be the determinant in the permissibility of usury. This went on to become the theological justification for what we see as today's capitalism. King Henry VIII in 1545 permitted the charging of interest up to a maximum rate of 10%. This wasn't relegated to the Protestant work ethic only, and was soon came to be adopted by Catholic Christians in Italy, whereby within the 16th century, soon 87 banks had been set up with papal approval, despite insistent pleas of traditionalist theologians, being amongst them the Augustinians, the Dominicans, that interest charges taken by banks were contrary to all tradition, natural and divine law. This set in place the wheels of change that have resulted very much in the nature of banking that we see today. However, the Quranic prohibition on riba is clear and interest and remains. The definitive Quranic verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, which I will not read entirely, but starts off by saying, الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لا يقومون إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. The verse goes on to say that those who take interest will not stand except as someone who stands who's been touched by the devil. And this is because they have equated, or they've chosen to say, that trade is like riba, trade is like interest, but God has made permissible trade and He's prohibited riba. The verse goes on to end, but amongst the verse it goes on to say, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وذروا ما بقي من الربا إن كنتم مؤمنين فإن لم تفعلوا فأذنوا بحرب من الله ورسوله وإن تبتم فلكم رؤوس أموالكم لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون. There's a clear command in this verse which says, O you who believe, give up whatsoever remains of riba. And it says, in kuntum mu'minin, if you are believers, i.e. implying there's a challenge in that. But if you do not, then listen to a declaration of war from God and His Messenger. And if you turn back, then for you is your principle only. La tuzlimun wa la tuzlamun. Do not oppress, and you will not be oppressed. So the Quranic affirmation is that people who engage in riba, they suffer consequences in this life. It's as if they've been touched through devilish influences. And secondly, it goes on to say that someone who engages in this crime, the crime is of such manifest proportion that it equates to declaring war against the Creator of all creation. And it finally goes on to say that this riba has inherent within it oppression. So do not oppress others, and you will not be oppressed. This is what the Quran has to say about riba. And I want to illustrate some aspects of riba that have been touched upon by people who are not from the Islamic faith. And we'll find that what they say resonates with the Quranic affirmation. The first is structural violence. Structural violence was a definition, I think, defined by someone by the name of Margaret Mansfield in her book, Structural Violence, Seeds of Violence, Seeds of Hope. She basically says structural violence is a case of systemic oppression that causes both physical and psychological harm. It is short-sighted and it is reinforcing. Margaret Mansfield goes on to say that interest is the most prominent example of structural violence. Interest aligned with the money creation process of banks systematically moves money and wealth from the productive sector to the hands of a privileged minority who have no advantage other than the pre-existence of greater capital. To simplify this, what Margaret is basically saying is that every time an interest loan takes place and interest is introduced, interest is a debt on society that doesn't exist. That money just does not exist. And the only way you can pay back your interest, theoretically, although this is looked at by other means, is by the suffering of someone else. Someone has to go bankrupt for you to pay back your interest. And so at a macro level, when a capitalized societies are able to pay back the consistent interest that they're taking, this results in the suffering of someone else far, far away. You might not see Africa, you might not see that poor person dying of starvation, but don't think he's entirely separated from the nature of the commercial transaction you're engaged in. What Margaret is saying is that every time we see people going on about economic growth, we should take into account the dual nature of that sort. For someone to grow, who inevitably a minority, someone is suffering. India is currently in the phase of great economic growth. Yet people neglect that 40% of its population is beneath the world poverty line. They're not taken into account in that statistic. But that's because interest by its nature is structurally violent. What Margaret is saying is interest has dhulm, oppression. As the Quran said, this is a moral issue. Interest is morally repugnant. Interest has dhulm. That's the first point. The second point is systemic competition. Every time money is introduced, which doesn't exist, and for us to pay back, and I refer all of you to a book by Bernard Lietaer called The Future of Money, in which he puts forward a story called The 11th Round that introduces this idea of competition, and that story is available on the internet. The idea is that even though prior to interest or our modes of finance would often involve relationships, shared ownership, building of communities, interest is the opposite. You're encouraged to go and compete, to try and survive. Interest has within it the idea of scarcity. And this idea of scarcity has to be artificially and systematically introduced and maintained. Since nearly all loans are being lent out at interest through one form or mechanism or the other, some of these loans must end up in default, or the supply of money must grow. And this introduces the dynamic of scarcity and the competition, because at any stage, we always collectively owe more money than exists. This means that by nature, this competitive dynamic results in the financial system we see today. It eradicates diversity. If you go to the UK, which I'm from, you go to a mall and you might see PC World, Currys, Dixons. They're all, in theory, competitors. They're owning, they're in the same market, hardware, IT technology, but they're all owned by the same group, the Dixons group. This has resulted in a world that has been unprecedented in history. Never before in human history have we had so much poverty in the face of so much wealth. As Gandhi is reported to have said, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And the irony is, in that in classical economics, this inherent competition is seen as a good thing. The idea that we are encouraged to compete to pay back the interest. Another result of interest is the concentration and polarization of wealth. The wealthiest, in effect, receive an uninterrupted rent from whosoever needs to borrow to obtain this money. And by definition, this process allows those who have, i.e. the rich, to profit from those who don't have, i.e. those the poor. And so we see a world today where 225 people of the richest have more wealth than 2.5 billion of the poorest. At one time, it was rumored that the 3 richest people of this world had more in terms of combined GDP than the 48 poorest countries of the world. This is absurd, but this is exactly what interest does. You see, interest is a mechanism of wealth transfer. It, by nature, allows for money to flow away from the ones with the greatest need of it, i.e. those who are poor, towards one who have the greatest wealth of it already. And this leads me to the last point, the incessant growth demand, which to me is the most illustrative, because the word riba comes from the root word rabwa, which implies growth. Yet the Quran says this growth is oppressive. And this is exactly what the legalization of interest did. It introduced a growth illusion, and I would refer, once again, we'll come to these books, but I refer all of you to read a book by Richard Douthwaite on the idea of the growth illusion and how it has impoverished the few, enriched the many, and endangered the planet. This idea of perpetual growth means that as you're constantly growing, the government has to introduce more and more debt as a way of alleviating the system. This idea of perpetual growth is disproportionate to the resources we have on the face of this earth. And while it is absurdly accepted that GDP growth is somehow a maxim for us to pursue, very few of us reflect as to what actually goes to constitute the GDP. The idea of toxic waste, cancer, divorce, weaponry, pornography as somehow contributing to GDP by the fact that they generate more and more income has been absurdly accepted as a measure of a nation's well-being. More concerned is the fact that this consumption produced by the growth is now bringing us to the state of an environmental collapse. The short-sighted nature of this way of looking at things has led to academics referring to agriculture, which is the part of the economy that is sensitive to climate exchange, as being of non-significance because it accounts for just 3% of national output. An Oxford economist is echoed to have said that even if net output of agriculture fell by 50% by the end of the next century, this is only a 1.5% cut in GDP. Such thinking, divorced from a realistic perspective of what's happening in the world, has led us to the state of environmental collapse. People like James Lovelock, the originator of the Gaia theory, has speculated that close to 80% of the human race is likely to be wiped out by the end of this century. Others, such as Martin Rees, a professor from Cambridge University, has said humanity has a 50-50 chance of surviving the end of the century. More than 1 million species worldwide have been likely to be driven to extinction by the end of 2050. Already, an estimated 90% of the large predator fish are gone. Already, half of the world's tropical and temperate forests are gone. And the reason is not because you and me, in our individual capacities, are given to a bit more consumption. What's fueling this consumption? What's fueling this is the debt-based growth paradigm. This debt and the consumption brings about is the fuel that is driving all of us, and by extension our societies and our corporations, to destroy everyone, to destroy the world. The logic of interest is the logic of the addict. It's the logic of arrogance, but it's also the logic of stupidity. It assumes that always and forever we will find some way to feed an endlessly growing need to consume. We'll always find a way out. We'll find some new energy resources. We'll find some new form of capital to convert into money. Technology will create fresh new markets. This is the continual assertion that man is the summation of all things. That man does not need to think about the effects his actions are having on humanity and nations. But, as in the nature of addiction, the continual justification only makes you sink more and more into a hole, maybe the lizard's hole. Interest is the major cause of the debt-based